Never thought I'd come back here. Did you? Well, unfortunately, for me in my horrible existence something caused me to come back. And if you don't know me, you really must have been missing out. My name is Travis, and I used to work at All King Creel's half-priced Voodoo store. First as an employee and then as King Creel's personal puppet. And then a lot of other horrible shit happened to me, including murdering my parents, being possessed by King Creel's spirit, and finally ending up here, in college. All in all, college is nowhere near as horrible as working at the Voodoo store. But in my condition, everything becomes 10 times more difficult. For starters, even though I was granted my eyes back from Baron Samedi, the rest of me still looks like the puppet I used to be. My body is paler than snow, I have big red circles on my cheeks, and the stitches holding my head on are plainly visible. So needless to say, attending college like that has posed serious challenges to my daily life. For one thing, I no longer live with Olivia and Alexandra. The college I'm attending is 3 hours away from their home, so I elected simply to move into a dorm. I managed to get a dorm with separate rooms, which saves me from always hiding my features from my roommate. I do this by applying a crap ton of foundation to my face to hide the circles and give my skin a normal not undead look. The stitches on my neck are a bit harder to hide. Hoodies and turtlenecks are all good and such. But when it gets hot I can feel the foundation melting off my face and posing a risk of exposing me. Sometimes I even wish I could wear a collar and just say I'm into that kinda crap. But it's not all horrible. My roommate Brian is very considerate and respects my need for space. Our first meeting with each other was definitely awkward. To say my personality has changed from my whole ordeal is an understatement. The old me, who was at best indifferent and at worst an asshole, is completely gone, replaced by the new me, timid, shy and afraid to be touched. "Hey man," Brian had happily declared when I first arrived through the door into our common area. "Travis, right? So good to meet you." Brian chuckled. He's a bit shorter than me, so I had to look down just a bit to look at him. Yeah, good to meet you." I nodded and looked around the place that was going to be my new home for who knows how long. "Where's my room?" I asked him softly, to which he perked up and nodded. "Oh, yeah. You must be tired, come and I'll show you." He went to put his arm around me to show me where we would have to go, but I instantly shuddered away from his touch, and backed away a few inches from him. "Please," I mumbled softly. I'm not good at the whole being touched thing," I told him, already feeling anxious and nervous about all this. But to my surprise, Brian quickly apologized. "Shit. Sorry man. I'm just a kinda handsy dude, but I respect that." He nodded to me, and pointed towards a closed door. "Your room's right there. Go ahead and get settled. If you want I can order you some food," he offered, clearly trying to make amends with me. "That'd be cool," I told him, walking over to my room and thanking him again as I closed the door and let out a loud haggard breath. Sliding down the door and curling up into a ball as I did my best to keep the memories of King Creel and the half-priced Voodoo store down in the abyss where they belonged. I mostly spend my days locked in my room working on any homework I have, or just staying out of Brian's view. He's a good guy. But I really don't think he's anywhere near ready to see the real me. I really don't think anyone outside of Olivia and Alexandra is. Although I do call them every night for whatever kind of support they can offer me. Olivia calling me big bro really does help make me feel better. Of course, it wouldn't be me if something terrible didn't happen to me on a regular basis. And it came as a double whammy. I was sitting in a lecture doing my best to keep up with the professor's points, but being out of school for a while really has dampened my skills at note-taking. All was going well enough until I was poked from behind by someone. I flinched hard at the foreign feeling, and stared back in a panic, only seeing a confused girl with a mechanical pencil staring back at me. "Do you have any lead?" she asked me. I stared mortified at her and nodded slowly, reaching into my hoodie pocket and handing her a container full of lead. She nodded thanks to me, and opened it up to put some into her pencil. She kept eyeing me as I waited for her to return it. When she finally did, she told me something that really sent me sputtering. "Your foundation is coming off," she told me as she handed me the little container of lead. I stared up at her in horror and quickly touched my face. And indeed I could feel it coming off from my cheeks. Wordlessly I quickly stood up and rushed out of the lecture hall. Leaving everything I came with on the seat I had taken. Making it to the bathroom, I quickly slammed the stall door closed and pulled out my phone to see how bad it was. It was enough for the circles on my cheeks to be visible. I sighed as I took out more foundation and slathered it back on my face. I returned to the hall soon after, and took my seat wordlessly as I continued in vain with keeping up with the notes. The whispers from the girls behind me didn't help much as the rest of the day went on. When the day was all done, I returned to my dorm room, and just wanted to lock myself in my room, and never leave again. Although something threw me off when I entered the dorm. Brian was nowhere to be seen. He usually was on the couch playing video games or watching Netflix, since the common room has a pretty nice flat screen. So not seeing him there when I returned was really a confusing sight for me. It wasn't usual that I had the dorm all to myself. Although I wasn't going to risk taking my makeup off, I did spend a little bit outside of my room, going into the kitchen and just making myself a sandwich. As I was waiting for the bread to pop up from the toaster, the front door opened and Brian came whistling in. "Hey, Travis. You're actually outside. Now that's something for the history books." He chuckled, walking over to me and offering me a fist. I looked at it and smiled a bit, giving him the fist bump he wanted. "Yeah, I was surprised you weren't in here," I told him, looking over when the toast popped and proceeding to get it out and lay it on a plate. I then went about starting to put my condiments on there. "Oh, yay. Sorry I didn't let you know. I got a job," he said with a good amount of pride. I looked over at him and offered him my smile and nod. It's pretty normal for college students to get a job. Gotta pay off those loans after all. "That's cool. Where did you get a job at?" I asked, spreading some mayo on my bread. "Some weird voodoo store." He chuckled. "It's creepy as hell, but the pay is great. Honestly, I don't know why more students aren't going there to get a job. Like Jesus, man, I get 20 an hour." He laughed, going on to describe his job to me. All the while I was gripping the butter knife in my hand and trembling uncontrollably. "What's it called?" I asked him, interrupting whatever it was he was saying. I obviously caught him off guard. He was so busy telling me about the job that he had completely forgotten to inform me what it was even called. "Oh right. Got a bit carried away with that." He chuckled, looking at my sandwich with some kind of envy. "King Creole's voodoo shop or something like that. I dunno, I'll let you know after my next shift tomorrow." I wordlessly dropped my knife and left my sandwich and Brian to go over to my dorm, ignoring Brian's questions towards me, and finally just closing my bedroom door and starting to hyperventilate. That wasn't possible. It couldn't be possible. It wasn't fucking possible. Reaching over, I quickly grabbed my phone and started typing a message to Alexandra, only for a knock on the door to knock me out of my panic state. I looked over to the door and stood up a bit from the floor I had collapsed to. Travis. You okay, man?" Brian's voice came from the other side. "If I said something that made you feel uncomfortable, I'm really sorry about it. Do you still want your sandwich?" he asked me, and I couldn't help but smile at that. "Go ahead and eat it. I'm just gonna turn in for the night," I told him, running a hand through my messy hair. I wanted to get the makeup off of me anyway, so now was as good of a time as any. "Alright, man. Take care of yourself there." Brian told me, knocking on the door is a sign of him leaving. And I was left alone as he turned on the TV and went about his normal schedule. I sighed and went over to my bed, getting some wet naps and starting to get the makeup off my face. As I went on, I couldn't stop thinking about what Brian had said. "That's not possible," I mumbled out loud, looking over to my phone and picking it up. Still wiping off my face, I pressed the call button for Alexandra and waited. Getting most of the makeup off, I tossed the dirty rag away in the trash near my bed. "Hello, Travis. How are things in university?" Alexandra's prim and proper voice asked me. Her voice was always a way of calming me down. Whether it was her soft and loving tones, or just that she treated me like a son, whatever it was, it made me feel much better just hearing it. "Hey, Alexandra. I had a pretty rough day today." I sighed, laying back in bed and rubbing my eyes softly. I was always careful around them, really having missed them after having had buttons for eyes for so long. "Why is that?" she asked me, clearly shifting in her chair a bit. She always gets serious whenever I'm in some kind of upset state, or what have you. My makeup started coming off during class. I mumbled to her, wanting to get the least worst news out of the way first. I had to run to the bathroom to put more on, I explained to her, really just wanting to vent that embarrassing moment to her. "I'm sure it's much worse in your head than it is in practice," she told me, which while of little comfort was most likely true. Most college kids have way more on their plate than caring about a weird dude who wears 2 sweaters all the time and wears makeup. But it still made me feel like crap. "Yeah, probably," I told her, swallowing and getting ready to tell her what was really troubling me at the time. "And my roommate got a job at a voodoo shop that's opened up on campus apparently," I told her softly in a whisper. She was silent for a good while before taking a deep breath. "That can't be possible, Travis. He can't have come back," she tried to reassure me. I swallowed hard and opened my mouth to try and counter her point. But just remembering his button eyes, stitched up mouth and his voice in my mind led to me starting to cry. "I'll call you later," I mumbled to her, hanging up before she could tell me anything, and just curled up in my bed as I tried to get some kind of hold over myself. "It's just a coincidence. He's dead. He can't come back. Never," I mumbled through tightly closed eyes. I repeated that mantra all through as I slowly drifted off to sleep. And that's when I had a dream. A nightmare. In it I was sitting in bed, looking around in confusion, looking down at my hands, and wondering why they suddenly weren't bleached white like they always were. I must have thought that I was awake or something. Going to the kitchen, I started making myself some coffee, yawning hard as I rubbed my hair, and just wondering why everything felt so strange. It was uncanny, and not really real. I just stared at the coffee maker as it made its noises and spit out coffee. "No," I whimpered, tears streaming down my face as I felt another hand come onto my other shoulder. I wanted to reach out to the coffee pot and smash it into his face. And yet I was completely frozen in terror as he gripped my shoulders tightly. "You really have been doing well without me." The voice chuckled, his nails digging into my shoulders and causing me to cry out in pain. "For a puppet without strings, you really have distinguished yourself." "You're supposed to be dead," I mumbled back, trying to get away from the claws in my shoulders. But the more I tried to get away from him, the tighter his grip on my shoulders became. "I already died once, Travis my boy," he said in that sweet songy voice of his. "Can't really kill something that's already been dead." The claws suddenly let me go, only for his hands to grab my face, to keep me from turning around to look at him. "I wouldn't look at me right this moment, Travis. I'm not decent." I swallowed hard as I did my best to keep myself under control. Finally, I reached out and grabbed the coffee pot with what little strength I had, and went to quickly smash it against his head. And when I saw what he looked like, I let out a loud scream, which woke me up in bed with a jolt as I hyperventilated. What I saw didn't look like the old King Creole. The only thing those two had in common was their button eyes. But this thing was an emaciated figure with long sharp claws and disproportionate limbs. It was like King Creole had been stretched out and turned into a bigger nightmare than he once was. I don't know what he was, if it was just a horrible nightmare, or if that cockroach really has found a way to crawl his way out of hell to continue to torture me. What I do know is that I need to keep my roommate safe and stop him from making the same mistakes that I made. And I need to visit the new half-priced Voodoo store. As much as I wanted to go running to tell Brian, I couldn't. For one, I hadn't put my makeup on yet, so that was clearly the first glaring issue. Pulling myself out of bed quickly, I grabbed my foundation and started slathering it on quickly. A million things were running through my head as I did this. How could Creole have dragged himself out of hell? We had a deal with Baron Samedi that made it so that would never happen again. More importantly, how could he have opened up the Voodoo store on campus? Creole may have had deep connections and ways around it back in my hometown, but here, it didn't make any sense at all. But I didn't have time to dwell on the logistics of Creole's return. Hearing the front door opening, I quickly finished up makeup and flung my door open, happy that I had fallen asleep in my hoodie. Brian, I shouted, only to lose my composure at just how loudly I had shouted his name. He looked back at me with a concerned raised brow, looking down at himself and patting his chest and pants. Yeah, that's me, he offered lightheartedly. Pretty sure at least. He gave a chuckle, letting the doorknob go and coming closer to me. What's up, man? Are you feeling any better? He asked, probably still worried about how I had just up and abandoned my sandwich. Yeah, I'm doing okay. Where is this place you work at? I asked quickly before he could try and steer the conversation anywhere else that I didn't want to discuss. He looked at me a bit and offered me a smile. Thinking about visiting, huh? It's just south of campus. He pointed towards our window, as if the store was right outside of it. I followed his finger and made a mental note of that. I'll be happy to see you there. But don't you have class today? He asked me with a tilted head. I stared at him, and then quickly pulled out my phone and checking the date, I looked back at him with wide eyes. Shit, I muttered. I was going to be late, and I wasn't going to be able to really tell him about the Voodoo shop. I'll try and swing by this afternoon. Be safe, I told him awkwardly. Aw, thanks, man. He chuckled, offering me his fist, which I bumped with a roll of my eyes. Feeling dumb for even just saying that, Brian went on his way and I quickly began to round up all of my items for the day. Taking a moment to breathe, I did my best to try and calm myself down. Even if Creole was back, he wouldn't do anything to me when I was in a group of students. Probably. Holding on to that small hope, I sighed and headed towards my class. Making it there before the professor, I took my seat in the middle and laid out some of the items I was gonna be using today, taking a moment to look around to make sure no one was watching. I pulled my phone out to check on my foundation. It was still holding on strong for the time being, which also calmed me down. As I shoved my phone back in my pocket, I finally took notice of the girl who had taken a seat near me. I flinched a bit when we locked eyes, and my face got hot when I realized it was the girl I had given the lead to the day before. You should use a setting spray, she told me as she looked me up and down. I stared back at her with a look of confusion. She then chuckled and reached into her bag, pulling out a spritz tube and handing it to me. It'll stop your foundation from coming off when you get hot, she explained to me. Thanks, I told her, awkwardly reaching out and taking the item to examine it, then looking up at her with a bit of shame in her knowing at least a part of my secret. But to my surprise she just smiled and nodded, going back to her items. Guess Alexandra was right, I did sorta make a bigger deal out of it than it needed to be. The lecture went on. I as usual struggled to keep up with notes, and really just struggled to keep my mind off anything but the Voodoo store. It made no sense. Why would he bother opening it up on the campus? Why wouldn't he have just appeared to me and just taken me out like that? Why bother with my roommate? I struggled through the rest of the lecture until at last the professor finished whatever he was talking about. It was time to leave. I quickly started piling everything into my bag. Sorry, I stammered, looking up at her and then back at my things. I don't like to be touched, I told her quickly, still shoving things into my backpack. My mouth hung open in both shock and awe. Now this was something I wasn't expecting at all. Travis. Travis. I offered her, running my hands through my hair on instinct. She offered a smile to me and chuckled. Riley. Nice to meet you, Travis, she said with a smile before turning to leave. I watched her leave and let a breath out I didn't know I was holding. I awkwardly stared at the bottle of setting spray she had given me, and slowly put it into my hoodie pocket. Shaking off the weird encounter with Riley, I quickly made my way out onto the campus grounds, and started fast walking towards the south part of campus. A million things on my mind, and soon they were about to be answered. As I walked out into the southern parking lot, I took notice of just how many stores and places were opened and catered towards the kids of the college. King Creel's all Voodoo shop. I tilted my head at that. In all the forms that the King Creel's all Voodoo shop. I tilted my head at that. In all the forms that the shop had been created, it never had Creel's name first, and was never called a shop. Sure, I called it a shop once in a while, but it was always called store. And this one was clearly not half-priced either. All of this was just piling onto my confusion. Heading over, I took a deep breath and opened the front door. What struck me first was how new everything looked. Everything was spotless. And the shelves were actually stocked with items, and even had candy and other shit besides voodoo dolls and potions. To say I was confused was an understatement of this century. Maybe even the millennium. Travis. Brian's voice pulled my attention over to the counter. A modern cash register next to him as he put down his phone and crossed the counter to come and meet me. What do you think? Pretty cool, right? He asked me, a big smile plastered on his face. Yeah, it's pretty chill here. My boss is pretty cool as well, Brian said, carrying on like nothing was wrong. Which I guess in his mind there wasn't. I meanwhile was losing every single one of the brain cells I still had left trying to figure this shit out. Oh, Mr. Brooks, this is my roommate Travis. Brian introduced us as the mystery man closed the distance between us. We looked at each other before the man offered his hand to me, and offered a smile to me. Preston Brooks, he told me, shaking my somewhat limp and trembling hand as I stared up at him in complete confusion. Who the hell was this guy? He didn't sound like Creel, act like him, nothing. So who the fuck was he? Nice to meet you. Quite the shop you have here, I said dryly, trying to pass whatever conversation skill check this interaction needed. Preston nodded and looked around his shop. It isn't much, but it certainly is enough. Anything, in particular, you're looking for? He asked me, turning his head back to me. Before suddenly he sputtered into a coughing fit. Reaching into his pocket and pulling out a napkin, he coughed into it. Sorry, this damn cough just won't leave me be. He chuckled. No, I'm just here to visit Brian. Where did you come up with the name? I asked him, waiting for him to finish up his coughing fit. When he did, he looked at me for a bit, and then looked out towards the window as if thinking the question through. "It's my favorite Elvis movie," he told me. I dropped my jaw at him at that. That blew me away, in more ways than one. The fact that King Creole despised that movie and the song that went along with it, and the fact that this man had used it for the name of his voodoo shop. "Cool. Brian, I'll meet you back at the dorm," I told him, really just wanting to get away from here and quick. "Oh sure. Thanks for visiting, man," he told me, fist bumping me, and going back behind the counter to do his job. I turned to leave, a million things going on in my mind. The sound of Preston coughing was more than enough to get me out the door. I decided to skip the rest of my classes for that day, and stumbled back to our dorm room, just at a loss for the events that transpired. Collapsing onto the couch, I just stared at the ceiling, trying to process everything in my mind. There was no way. There were far too many coincidences for this to just be a random new voodoo shop that opened up on campus. It made zero sense to me. I stared up at the ceiling for what only seemed like a few minutes, but the sound of my stomach growling really meant that I had been staring at it for a couple of hours. Forcing myself off the couch, I walked over to the small kitchen area we had. Going through the fridge, I sighed to myself. Not only at the lack of food we had, but because of everything that had happened today. It was like a semi had hit, and then made it worse, by backing up over me. All those thoughts ended when I started hearing scratching noises. It was subtle at first, but then it quickly picked up in intensity. I slowly closed the fridge door, and went about trying to figure out where it was coming from. I thought that maybe a squirrel or something was scratching at the window, but a quick glance quickly dispelled that idea. As I kept listening to the noises, it became apparent that it wasn't scratching. Something was crawling around in the dorm. Walking over towards the sink, I reached in and grabbed a steak knife. It was dirty and had chunks of steak on it, but if something was in here, it was going to do at least some kind of damage to them. And hopefully not damage me as much as I would damage it. So it wasn't on the floor. Sitting up, I looked around like a junkie trying to find his stash. It was starting to get more annoying than scary, and I finally was about to give up when I noticed something. When I moved, I heard the crawling. When I stopped, I couldn't hear it anymore. To test this out, I walked over towards my room. And the scratches followed me. Gripping the handle of my steak knife, I stared up at the ceiling. And two black buttons stared back at me. The Creole from my nightmare was dangling from the ceiling, his claws dug into the roof, and had been crawling back and forth following me as I searched in vain for the source of the noise. Paralyzed by fear, I was unable to act as he unhooked himself from the ceiling, and landed on his long gangly legs in front of me. "You look like you've seen a ghost," he chuckled, his long gangly body straightening itself out. In this new horrifying form, he towered over me by several feet. The freak was already tall enough, but now he really looked every bit the monster he was. "Oh, poor little Travis," he mocked me, wrapping those long spider-like fingers around my throat and starting to squeeze it tight, sending me into a sputtering coughing fit, trying to pry them off of me before he did anything to me. "Just a puppet without his strings. Would you like me to fix that?" he snarled, rubbing his clawed fingers along the stitches on my neck. He then dug his claws into it and started to push my head upwards, straining the stitches and sending me into a full-blown panic. "Stop it," I screamed at him, reaching out and grabbing his button eyes and tearing them off from his face. He dropped me and flailed around as he growled loudly at me. Reaching down, I grabbed the fallen steak knife, and going to stab him, I suddenly was jolted awake by Brian shaking me. "Travis, you okay, man?" he asked me, finally letting me go when he saw that I was in fact conscious again. "Jesus, man. You freaked me out. I came in, and you were on the floor having a seizure or something, he said, obviously freaking out. I looked around and tried to wrap my head around what had just happened. You freaked me out. I came in and you were on the floor having a seizure or something. What I muttered, looking around and seeing that the steak knife was over by the door to my bedroom. Swallowing some, I looked up at Brian, and figured now was good enough time to tell him about what I had been through. Hey Brian, I told him, once he had calmed down enough to believe that I was okay. I need to tell you about the half-priced Voodoo store I used to work at. Brian didn't believe me at first. I mean, I wouldn't either, if I'm being honest. But he listened until I finally got to a part where I was able to show him a bit of proof. When explaining when I was turned into a voodoo puppet, I slowly lowered my collar to show him the stitches that keep my head on my shoulders. Then to show him further proof, I grabbed a napkin and rubbed most of my makeup off, showing Brian for the first time my real face. Shit man, Brian said, barely able to really process the information in front of him. LD tell he wanted to touch my stitches to make sure they were real. So I did him one better, tilting my head to the left as much as I could. My stitches strained and for a moment my head separated slightly from my neck. To say that convinced him would be an understatement. So that's why I'm worried about where you're working, I explained to him. Finishing up the job of removing my foundation and making it so that I was showing him all of my pale fat. It doesn't make sense for me that he's back, I mumbled to him. Brian was still reeling from what I had shown him, but he quickly calmed himself down and nodded a bit. Even if he's back, why would he be after me? I mean, yeah, we're roommates, but we barely interact with each other. This was true since I stayed locked in my room for most of the day. That's what's so confusing to me, I told him, trying to piece together the cockroaches' plan. It had to involve this new voodoo shop in some way. There was no way it just happened to open up, and then suddenly I was having nightmares about Creole inside the dorm. Preston doesn't seem at all like King Creole, Brain said, breaking the train of thought I was trying to build. Really, he seems like a pretty chill dude. He just coughs a lot, but if he's sick I can't really blame him. Brian shrugged, getting off the couch where we had been sitting and heading over to the fridge. What do you guys even sell? Just like trinkets or something? I asked. Watching him come back to the couch with some sodas for the two of us. I took mine and carefully sipped from it. I still haven't got the whole drinking thing down, so sometimes it leaks out of my stitches. Yeah, pretty much, he said, taking a swig from his soda and thinking to himself. Yeah, we really don't sell anything too weird. Dolls, candy, etc. No wishes to speak of. Taking another swig from his soda, I could tell he was still staring at me in between his swigs. Can you just watch your boss? See if he does anything strange. At all? I asked him softly, taking slow and careful sips of my soda, and so far succeeding in not having a leak. Brian turned to me with a smile and nodded. Sure man, and thanks for trusting me with this secret of yours. He offered me his first, which I returned with a smile, and a bump of my own. And if I'm being honest, you look pretty cool, he said with a chuckle, finishing off his soda and placing the bottle on the table in front of us. You should have seen me, when I had button eyes. I offered with a weak chuckle, closing the cap on my soda and standing up to go put it back in the fridge. While walking past my room, I leaned down and picked up the steak knife, looking up to the ceiling to see if there was any sign of Creel's claw marks. But there wasn't. With a defeated sigh, I placed the knife back in the sink and put my soda in the fridge. Hey, Travis. I'm going out with a couple of friends tonight. Any chance of you joining us? Brain asked with some hope in his voice. I looked over at him and smiled a little. My fingers reached up to scratch my stitches. A sort of nervous tic I've developed. Maybe next time. I really just want to try and sleep, I told him, feeling bad when I saw he was a little sad about that. But he nodded knowingly, and let me go back to my room with another fist bump. Walking back into my room, I felt like a weight had been lifted off my shoulders. Brian was pretty cool with me being the way I am. And I could now safely walk around the dorm without worrying about him catching me without my makeup. Closing the door to my room, I pulled out my phone and set it to charge on my little nightstand. I was about to lay back in bed when it started ringing. Staring at it, I saw that it was Alexandra. Nodding at that, I reached over and picked up my phone. Hello. Travis, I'm scared. A soft little voice came from the other end. My eyes shot wide open when I realized it was Olivia on the other end. Why? What's wrong? I asked with more than just a little urgency in my voice. But it was quickly dispelled with her next sentence. I'm afraid there's a monster under my bed, she softly mumbled to me. I couldn't help but let out a little chuckle at that. Despite everything she'd been through and seen, Olivia still is only 8 years old. Aha, she told me quickly. Whatever she did, it never failed to bring a genuine smile to my face. She was so innocent, and yet I knew she had a powerful drive beneath her small little body. Then Tempe will protect you from anything that might be hiding under there, I told her, lying back in bed with the phone against my ear, and continuing on with my assurances that she was going to be okay. It took a bit more convincing, but I finally got her to believe that Tempe would protect her. Okay, she finally said to me, yawning a little bit since it was past her bedtime. Thank you, big bro. A name that always tugged at my heart. I smiled at her even though she was several miles away. Sleep well, Livy, I told her, ending the call and placing my phone back on the stand to charge. Laying my head on my pillow, I stared up at the ceiling. Sleep was still a strange subject for me. For so long as a puppet I hadn't been able to, and suddenly I was now able to sleep once again. Sure, it was only for a handful of hours, but it felt amazing coming from nothing. Finding myself still staring up at the ceiling, I finally rolled over on my side to try and get a few winks of sleep. Whether I was even going to be able to was another thing. With so many thoughts running through my mind about Creole and the voodoo shop. It was a wonder if I slept for even half an hour. Rolling around in bed, I couldn't help but feel that something was off. I couldn't tell if it was something about my bed, or I just wasn't tired. Rolling around some more, I finally settled on just staring at my bedroom door until I either fell asleep or morning came. Whatever was going to come first. Finally, slowly closing my eyes, I was jolted awake by scratching coming from somewhere. Sitting up in bed quickly, I looked around in pure panic for the source. I must have fallen asleep, and that meant that he most likely was here. "Where are you, you asshole?" I shouted, my voice trembling with obvious fear and not bravado at all. I reached into my pocket trying to find any kind of weapon to fight against him. Well, I don't think lint is his weakness, so I was definitely out of luck in that department. My gaze turned to the ceiling, fully expecting to see him, but when I didn't, I began to panic even more. "Never played hide and seek, Travis my boy?" his voice asked me. It felt like it was coming from my head and gave me no idea at all as to where he might be. I gripped my blankets tightly as my eyes darted in every direction to where he might be. "Alright, you asshole. Where are you?" I mumbled, swallowing the bile building up in my throat and getting out of bed quickly. My eyes were dead set on the closet. It was the only spot that the freak could possibly be hiding in. Walking over to it, I flung the doors open, only to be met with all my sweaters and hoodies staring back at me. I was beyond confused. Reaching into the closet, I threw everything out in some vain attempt to try and find him. And that was when it hit me. What Olivia had called me about. The bed. Had turned towards the bed, and to my horror, his long gangly arms shot out from the side of the bed. His claws digging into the floor and scraping along the floor as he pulled himself out from underneath my bed, stumbling into my closet. I stared in fear as this giant lumbering creature pulled itself out from underneath my bed. "Should have paid attention to little Miss Olivia," he chuckled as he pulled himself straight and cracked his bones into place. In one step he was already close enough to reach me, but instead, he bent down and pushed his face close to mine. "After all, you don't have any way of defending yourself like she does." He smiled, his rows of jagged yellow teeth menacingly staring back at me. "You can't hurt me anymore," I shouted back at him, going to swing at him, only for him to easily catch my hand and slam me into the closet, picking me up and tossing me into the wall with a force that took every ounce of air I had in my lungs from me. "Oh, can't I?" he said with a cackle, walking over to me and lifting his pointer finger up at me. And with a swift motion, he stabbed me with it in the shoulder, causing me to scream aloud as he drove it deeper and deeper. "This is only the beginning, Travis. I'm going to enjoy these next few days." He drove his finger in deeper, causing me to scream louder. "Just leave me alone. Please just leave me alone," I screamed at him as he twisted his finger around inside my shoulder, reaching out to grab his arm and try to pull it out from my shoulder. All he did was return a smile to me and drive it even deeper until it came out behind me and pinned me to the wall. "Oh no, you don't get to just ruin everything I've created, and just beg me to leave you alone. I'm not going to stop until I take everything from you," he snarled, pushing his face mere inches from mine. "It's time to wake up, my little puppet." With that, I gasped and awoke in bed, drenched in sweat and gripping my shoulder tightly, staring at it and half expecting it to be drenched in blood. But there was nothing there at all. I breathed hard and carefully looked underneath my bed. Finding nothing there, I sighed to feed it and got out of bed. Brian had classes that morning, but it left me a note explaining that he would watch Preston nice and closely for any signs that he might be King Creole. I didn't have classes until the afternoon, but feeling so uneasy about being in the dorm alone, I figured I might as well get out and try to be social for once. I slipped into one and left the dorm, making sure it was locked before heading down towards the campus grounds to get something to eat. Settling on some pizza, I sat down and softly blew on it as I waited for it to cool down. It felt nice to be somewhat normal with people. Smiling as I finally bit into my slice, I looked around at everyone running around and getting places. It made me wonder if any of them had ever been in the same situation I was in. Probably not, but it made me feel better to think as much. Yeah. Go ahead," I said, scooching a bit as she sat on the other side of the booth. "Thank you for the spray," I mumbled shyly, looking down at the pizza in front of me, and slowly nibbling on it to avoid any kind of eye contact with her. "Don't mention it," she giggled, watching me eat for a moment before also going ahead and eating her slice. You don't remember me, do you? She finally asked after a moment. I looked up at her with a raised brow. I know, sorry. I'm really bad with names and faces. I told her. I was trying my best to remember her face. But nothing was clicking. What with the horrifying voodoo man that was threatening to ruin my existence really taking priority? High school silly. We worked on that science project together. She chuckled, pulling her phone out and showing me a picture of us at the science fair. And it was then that I really felt stupid. The only girl who had ever really given a crap about me in school. Fuck. I'm stupid. I sighed, planting my face in my hands, silently freaking out and quickly pulling them away when I remembered the makeup on my face. It's okay. She giggled again, putting her phone away. I almost didn't recognize you either, Travis. You don't exactly act the same, she said, eating her pizza and really eyeing me. I pouted a bit, but she was definitely right. It's such a long story. I sighed, shaking my head and biting into the remaining crust of my pizza. Maybe I'll tell you. But right now, just know that I appreciate this spray. I told her, smiling up at her. She returned the sentiment and nodded at me. We could have gone on longer, but my phone ringing pulled my attention away from her. Looking at it, I saw that it was Brian. We had exchanged numbers when we first moved in just in case something happened, and we needed to contact each other. Brian, what's up? I asked him, looking at Riley and holding up a finger to her, which she nodded and just went about drinking her soda. Dude, did you remember to lock up? Brian asked me. I got back from class, and the door was flung open, and shit is thrown everywhere. He told me. I looked up at Riley and quickly started collecting my garbage. I have to go, I told her quickly. Yeah, I definitely locked it. I have the key in my pocket. I told him quickly, shoving the garbage into the trash and quickly running off towards the direction of my dorm room. Oh shit, you're right. Cause the doorknob has been broken the fuck off. Brian told me, causing me to panic even more. Looks like they just kinda stayed in the common room. Both our doors are closed, but I'm gonna double check. He told me. Sounds good, I'll meet you there, I told him, hanging up when it was confirmed, and thinking of every way in which that bastard could have snuck his way into our dorm. Well, not snuck, more like forced his way into it. One thing was obvious to me. He was going to continue his threats to me until I either stopped him, or he made good on those threats. My only idea was to stop sleeping. But that came with its own set of problems. The fear of other Travis appearing once again. It would definitely be stacked against me if both he and Nightmare Creel would team up. Well, whatever happens, I'm going down swinging. If you are liking this series so far, make sure to hit the thumbs up and subscribe, so I can reach 1,000 subscribers, and keep creating new contents for you guys. Arriving back at the dorm, it was clear that Brian had sugar-coated what had happened just a little bit. The door was nearly torn off its hinges, and the whole dorm was in complete disarray. The couch had been flipped over, and just by looking towards my room, I could tell that it was also in a state of a complete mess. You made it seem like it wasn't that bad, I told Brian when he came out of his room, when he heard me come in, looking around and nodding a bit. Anything taken? I asked him, flipping the table over and putting the items back on top of it. Walking over and motioning to help him flip the couch back over. Grunting along with him, I flipped it back over and sighed. Well, I'll go see the damage in my room, I guess. I sighed, walking over and reaching out to grab my doorknob. I barely grabbed it when the entire door fell forward into my room. staring at it with just the smallest bit of resentment. I took a step into my room, and found it utterly and completely trashed. It was worse than the common room, and just by a hunch much worse than Brian's room. Sighed as I looked around at the smashed and destroyed items around my room. I didn't come with much, but the little amount had basically been smashed and thrown across the ground. I'd say pretty good chances. I sighed, going over to my bed and checking under it, half expecting those button eyes to be staring back at me. But thankfully there was nothing under there but the suitcase I had brought when I moved in. Pulling myself up with an old man grunt, I looked around the room and just felt tired looking at the mess I was going to have to clean up. It's weird, they didn't even touch my room. Like at all. Brian said from my doorframe, looking around at my mess and heading back into the common room when I exited my completely trashed room. Alright, well I have classes in a few hours and you have to work soon, right? Maybe together we can clean all this up. I sighed, not really feeling the urge to report this to anyone. What would I tell them? My freaky undead voodoo boss broke in and trashed the place. Brian barely believed me at first. Why would anyone else? Together I and Brian were able to get the common room in some kind of clean state. And I said I could handle my room while he went to work. With the promise to keep an eye on Preston to see if he did anything strange. Once he left I looked around the dorm and felt just a tiny bit unnerved by something. For once I'm glad I have class, I mumbled to myself, walking back into my destroyed room and picking up my makeup from the floor, and going about fixing the smear I had created on myself. Was in the middle of gathering my stuff for class when my phone rang. Fishing it out of my pocket I saw it was Alexander. Pressing the speaker button I placed the phone on my bed, and went about my makeup. Hello Alexandra, I'm in a bit of a hurry. Good afternoon, Travis. Her soft motherly voice filled my room as she spoke. It was always a comforting feeling to have her or Olivia call me. Are you free tomorrow? Me and Olivia wish to visit you, she said. The sound of Olivia being excited on the other end did even more to make me smile. I should be free tomorrow, I said as I finished up my makeup and made sure I still looked somewhat presentable. I told Brian about everything, so he knows pretty much everything about what happened. I explained to her. Moving away from my backpack from the mess of Moving away from my mirror and fishing my backpack from the mess of my room, and checking to make sure both nothing evil was in there, and that I had everything for class. I can't wait to see you, she shouted excitedly, bringing a smile to my face as I looked over to my phone. Me too, Livy. See you guys tomorrow. I ended the call and sighed out the little bit of breath I was holding in my lungs. Picking up my backpack I headed for the door, and realized a predicament. Mostly the fact that the front door was almost completely blown off its hinges. Entering my next class I took my usual spot away from most people, and did my best to follow whatever it was the professor was teaching today. Honestly, for as much as I hate being in class and struggling to try and keep up with everyone else, this is still far better than being at the Voodoo store, which just made me more worried for Brian working at this seeming knockoff shop. As these thoughts kept filling my head I kept trying to scribble down on my notes. Sighing hard I had thought that I should just give up when suddenly that idea was thrown out the window. Looking around at the other students I flinched out of my chair and fell down, looking around at all of them. They were all suspended by string, with their eyes and mouths sewn shut. I stood up quickly and moved to the closest student to me. poking them for any kind of reaction. They were hanging from strings and mindlessly scribbling on their notes or typing on their laptops if they had one. I looked around at all of them and then down at me. Luckily enough for me, I wasn't under the strings' control. "Travis, is there something the matter?" Creel's soft voice pulled me away from the horror around me, and drew my attention down to where the professor had been teaching. He stared back at me with a smile on his face as he tossed the lifeless body of my professor on the floor. "Seems like you fell asleep in class." He chuckled, tilting his head at me, which cracked and crunched like he hadn't cracked it in years. How I was just taking notes," I shouted back at him, looking over at my desk as if to confirm it. Walking back over and checking my notes, I saw that I hadn't been doing that at all. "To think that you fell asleep in a class that you're paying for?" This nightmare, Creel chuckled, taking a long gangly step towards me. When he did so, all the students turned their heads towards me, their sewn-up faces hiding their expressions. But the air I felt around them was plain enough for me to tell they were pissed off and angry. "Should have just stayed put in the shop, Travis. Would have been better for you." Creel's voice came closer and closer. Looking over, I caught sight of him climbing up on the desks, and easily walking on top of them over to me. "Oh yeah, being your stupid puppet for eternity would definitely be better than this," I shouted back at him, fishing in my pocket for any kind of item that could help defend myself. Pulling out the pen I had been using for writing, that wasn't going to help me, unless, before I got in another war of words with Creel, I quickly clicked the pen and jammed it into my hand. Flinching hard, I suddenly fell out of my desk and looked around in complete confusion. Looking up, I saw that a few of the other students were looking at me like I was an idiot. Which I guess I am. Standing back up and sitting back in my chair, I sighed and decided just to not try for the rest of the lecture. Staring down at my hand, I saw that there was a small hole staring back at me. Now, when my hands had been drilled into when I was turned into a puppet, they eventually healed around the strings in my hand. So seeing a tiny hole staring back at me made me unsettled, even if I was the reason it had happened. When the lecture was finally over, I made my way out of and quickly started heading to my dorm. Carefully opening the door, I poked my head into it and looked around to make sure all was still well. It was, so I pushed the door all the way open and stepped in. Checking my phone in hopes to see if Brian had messaged me, I let out a worried sigh when I saw he hadn't. I paced around the dorm a bit before heading back to my room to try and clean it up. Finally getting my room back to a state of messy clean that I enjoyed, I then decided that instead of staying here and accidentally falling asleep, I might as well try and do something that I hadn't done in a long time. That's almost as terrifying as Nightmare Creel is. Getting up all my social skills, I headed out and down towards the same area I had gotten my pizza at. And I already regretted my decision when I saw Riley and her group of friends coming out of one of the shops nearby. "Travis." Riley's excited voice came as I tried to turn around and escape. She came over and smiled as her friends followed after her, obviously not happy at being dragged over to see this obviously awkward idiot in front of them. "Hey Riley," I mumbled to her, reaching up to scratch my stitches and catching myself before I revealed them to anyone. I was just passing through," I told her, looking over at her friend group and praying my foundation held up. "That's cool. We were just heading outside. Wanna join us?" she asked, looking up at me. I swallowed nervously and suddenly was really regretting my choice to try and socialize. "Come on, at least walk us over to our dorms," she asked me, to which I finally agreed. "Hey, aren't you the guy that fell out of your chair during the last lecture at psychology?" one of her friends asked me, a raised brow directed at me. I swallowed yet another lump in my throat and thankful that this foundation was hiding both my painted red cheeks and my actually red cheeks. "Oh yeah, had a nightmare," I quickly explained away as I walked with them out of the hall, and onto the campus grounds, sticking close to Riley, since she was the only one I knew in this group of ladies. Really? In high school, you slept through everything. One time you slept through a fire drill. Riley teased at me, nudging me playfully, causing me to panic slightly at being touched, but managing to hold it in against the building wall of uncomfortableness. A lot has changed since then, I told her with just a hint of sorrow in my voice. She seemed to pick up on it, and turned to talk to me, but we didn't get much of a chance. Hey, let's head in here real quick, one of her friends called out, pointing my attention to the Voodoo shop. My stomach sank even further upon seeing that we had found our way over there. This was just the group of people I dreaded seeing in the Voodoo shop, because I knew I would have to clean up. Why? Riley asked, her attention turning from me back to her friends. What business do you have, Becky? She asked Becky, a girl with a Karen haircut in the making by the looks of things. I want to get a good luck charm for my test tomorrow, she hummed, turning and heading towards her entrance. Everyone else followed, except for me and Riley. She groaned and looked over to me. You coming with? She asked me, with eyes that basically begged me to follow her in. Reluctantly I nodded back and smiled a little when she smiled up at me and thanked me. Together we entered the Voodoo shop to see Brian at the counter talking to one of the girls. Yo, Travis, he said, more than a little surprised to see me outside of the house. And with a random girl as well. Riley looked up at me surprised as well. Probably from the fact I had an actual friend. He's my roommate, I explained to her. Just your roommate. I'm hurt, Travis. Brian pouted, obviously faking it. I rolled my eyes at him, and turned back to Riley. He's my roommate and very annoying, I corrected. Thank you very much, Brian said with a chuckle, turning back to finish talking with the girl at the counter, while the others looked around at the random knickknacks that were offered by this place. Me and Riley looked around together, ending up at the wall of voodoo dolls. Well, wall of voodoo doll templates. Unlike all King Creoles, these voodoo dolls weren't designed to look like people. They all just kinda looked like Tempe. Do you even believe any of this voodoo crap? Riley turned to ask me as she picked up a voodoo doll from the wall. I looked at her, and then down at my hand, imagining the torture and pain that the living voodoo doll had done to me, and what he had caused me to do to my parents. Yay, I mumbled back weakly, really at that point just wanting to leave and go back to my room. But our little awkward moment was interrupted by the sound of violent coughing from behind us. Both of us turned around to see Preston Brooks, supposed owner of this here voodoo establishment. So sorry kiddos. This call just gets worse and worse. He chuckled with a smile, putting the handkerchief he had coughed into back into his pocket and closed his hands together. Anything I can help you to find? Yay. What she said. I mumbled, backing up from him and into the wall of voodoo dolls. Shame, well let me know, if you need anything, he said with a smile, and left me there. I let out a breath of relief and soon flinched, when I felt a hand on my shoulder. It's me, dude. Sorry, I had to get your attention quietly, Brian told me, looking at me and then back at Preston, as he had his back to us helping Becky to pick out a charm for her test. Something's up with him, Brian whispered to me as he pulled me over to a corner. What do you mean? I asked him, looking at an item to make it seem like Brian was helping to explain what it was. Okay, so maybe he just has a disease or something. That isn't exactly bad, right? I asked him, placing the item back and picking up another one off the counter in the corner. No, except what comes out of his mouth. That handkerchief at the start of the day is white. Look at the color now. We both turned our heads to see. The item was completely black as he put it back into his pocket and continued helping Becky out. Point taken, I said shakily, going back to looking at the item and starting to think. Me and Creole, whenever we got hurt, always leaked out a black ooze from our bodies. which from what Alexandra had told me was our soul trying to escape. Hence why Creel's mouth is sewn up, it keeps his soul from leaking out. Plus he gets this weird dude coming in all the time. Looks like a slick business guy from the 80s or something. Hair slicked back and he's got giant bags under his eye. He always comes in around this time and they talk to each other in his office. As if on cue the front door opened and a man walked in holding an umbrella, despite the fact it was perfectly clear outside. "Ah, you're here." Preston chuckled, walking over and shaking the man's hand as he closed his large umbrella and used it as a kind of cane. "Whoever he is, I think he knows me." I swallowed and looked over to Brian. "I think I should leave before anything happens." "Hey, are you going to ring me up or what?" Becky suddenly asked, our attention turning to her, and Brian quickly nodded, leaving me with his usual fist bump and heading back behind the counter. "Oh my god, did you see who that was?" Riley suddenly came running over to me, excitedly grabbing my arms and pulling me along. I freaked out and pulled my arm away from her. She looked at me confused and just a little bit hurt. I bruised it when I fell out of my desk." I quickly lied. "Oh, shit, I'm sorry. But, did you see him?" she quickly said, changing the subject back to her excitement. "Yeah, who the hell is he?" I asked her, and she looked up at me like I had just called her the C-word or something. "That's Constantine Sinclair. He runs the Somber Rehab Center. It's my dream place to work. I want to help addicts get over their addiction and become normal parts of society again," she told me excitedly. All the while I looked on in terror towards that office door. Constantine Sinclair. I had heard Creel on the phone with him before, and now I'm finding out who the hell he actually is. Why the fuck does Creel know him? And why is he inside a voodoo shop? To say I wanted to run screaming from the voodoo shop was an understatement. I wanted to run screaming to a gas station for some gas to burn this fucker down. But instead I just sorta kept begging Riley if we could leave. Like a little kid begging his mom about something. Mostly because I didn't want to leave her anywhere near this place. She had seemed ready to go, but when Sinclair walked through those doors, she was hellbent on talking to him. Ryan for his part had just finished ringing up Becky when two more of her friends showed up with items to buy, prolonging our stay at the shop and only adding to my sense of dread and fear. My eyes kept darting over towards the manager's office, and just causing me to instinctively bite at my fingernails. Something I haven't done in years. "Travis, are you okay?" Riley asked me, after she was done talking with her friends about Sinclair arriving at the voodoo shop. And now that she was done I could tell that she knew something was wrong with me. Wasn't that hard? I looked like I was about to have a full-on mental breakdown. And I was. "I just want to leave," I quickly told her, forcing my finger out of my mouth before I ripped the whole nail off. "Is it okay if I just go?" I asked her, looking over at her and forcing my hands into my pockets to keep them from fidgeting like crazy. "Yeah. I'm sorry to be keeping you. We're close enough to our dorms where it's safe," she said, looking at me with just a hint of concern in her eyes. I nodded quickly and was starting to move towards the exit when the door to the office opened and I instinctively froze in place. "Mr. Sinclair." Riley's excited voice came from behind me as she quickly rushed over towards the gloomy, well-dressed man. He looked over at her and made a face that said he had just stepped on something disgusting. "You're far too loud," he told her as he clutched his umbrella looking like he wanted to bash it over Riley's head. "What do you want, girl?" Sinclair hissed, his eyes narrowing, and obviously annoyed that he had to socialize. I kinda felt that. "Oh?" Riley sputtered, clearly taken aback by Sinclair's attitude. I'm a follower of your work, and I hope one day you'll hire me at Somber, she said, most of the confidence disappearing from her voice. HM. The man mumbled, coming over to her, and looking at her. Perhaps. And with that, he walked past her, and headed towards me in the exit. He stared straight ahead and past me. His hands reached out to grab the door. Suddenly I felt a horrible chill across my body, and my legs began to move on their own. It wasn't like when the strings controlled me. This was like some force was physically making my legs move. I stared back at Riley and Brain as if they could save me, but neither of them was paying attention. "You're Travis?" Sinclair asked when the two of us were outside. He opened up his umbrella and stepped underneath it. Whatever was forcing my legs to move next moved up to my arms, and gripped them tightly. They kept me from moving as Sinclair walked around me, examining me like I was on display. "Yeah. I assume you work with King Creole?" I asked him, panting hard as I tried to act tough. Whatever was holding me still suddenly reached out and covered my mouth. I gagged and started coughing as whatever it was that was now covering my mouth was slimy, and smelled like rotting flesh. "I'll make this quick, since I could give a rat's ass about that voodoo freak," Sinclair said, stepping closer to me, and getting right in my face. "You're fucked. So fucked that you're better off just laying down, and accepting what's in store for you." He spat at me. His sunken, tired eyes were suddenly alive with rage and murderous intent. "Only reason I'm helping that idiot is that you fucked with my supply of addicts. You brought this on yourself, you stupid little shit." Sinclair growled, turning his back to me and walking off underneath his umbrella. Whatever was keeping me in place finally let go and allowed me to dry heave and cough violently as I watched him leave. As I did so, I watched as what I thought was his shadow slither into the shadow that the umbrella had been making. Why did I ever get involved in all this crap? First a living voodoo doll and now a freak with a moving shadow. Standing up and staggering my way back to the dorm, I entered it and collapsed to the couch, panting hard and rubbing my face hard. Sinclair's threats caused it, so I couldn't even rest there for long without being afraid and standing, so I could just pace the dorm in fear and paranoia. Any little creak that came from the woods sent me flinching in fear. So when the front door opened up I nearly shat myself but calmed down when I saw it was Brian. "Jesus man, you look like crap," he said with concern in his voice, coming over and slowly coaxing me to sit down on the couch while he made me something to calm down. My hands trembled as I softly took the cup of coffee from him. "What happened?" "I saw that Sinclair dude talking to you from inside the shop." "He knows about Creole," I stammered, taking a soft sip of the coffee, being careful so that it wouldn't leak out of my neck. He's some kind of freak like Creole that. I looked back over at Brian, who was sitting a good couple of feet away from me. Well, your friend Riley certainly seemed to think something was up with him." From all the shit I've seen about him, he's usually like one of those cherry assholes who donates all their money to charity and shit. Guess we caught a glimpse at the real him," Brian said, taking a long sip of his coffee. I stared down at mine, and swirled it around a bit. It needed more sugar, but I didn't want to bother Brian about it at that moment. "He said I was fucked. So whatever Creole is planning must really be something that's gonna fuck me up royally." I chuckled a little, more so to stop me from having a mental breakdown. Even going to college and this asshole is still finding a way to fuck with me. I sighed hard and took another small sip of my coffee. "I'm sorry dude. I'm doing my best to try and help you. But this is really beyond both of our comprehension. Can't you ask that one voodoo god dude help you out?" he asked me, setting his empty mug on the table and reaching out for his controller. I wouldn't even know how to begin to summon him. I only knew how to talk to him back home, because I accidentally ran into him. I guess when Alexandra comes here tomorrow she can help me. I sighed hard and rubbed my face more, not giving a crap about my makeup since it was just the two of us. "Oh cool, your family is coming. I can't wait to meet them," Brian said, just a little bit of excitement building up in his throat. I looked over at him and smiled. It would be a nice little escape to have Alexandra and Livy here to help me fight off Creole. Alright, man. I'm gonna be here if you need anything, Brian assured me, offering me a fist bump which I returned with a smile. Walking over to my room and carefully closing the barely held together door. I was in the process of taking off the last of my foundation when I heard scurrying under my bed. I spun on my heels and quickly looked towards my bed, reaching out and grabbing the nearest thing I could use as a weapon. Although I don't know how well a stick of deodorant was going to help me. Quickly looking underneath my bed, I was more scared to find nothing there. Quickly pulling up from underneath the bed, I looked around quickly, clutching my deodorant. I climbed into bed and looked around my room for a couple of hours until I finally drifted off to sleep. The fact I didn't have any kind of nightmare or any kind of dream at all that night, however, sent me awake in a mere instance. I looked around my room and making sure I wasn't asleep, I tried punching myself awake. Needless to say, a throbbing cheek later showed that I was indeed awake. Slowly climbing out of bed and still clutching my deodorant, I carefully exited to the common room and saw that it was indeed the next day. Brian worked early today, so I was left in the dorm by myself for the time being. I pulled my phone out and dialed Alexandra, hoping that she was near to the college. I really would rather have someone here than suffer in the dorm by myself. Travis, Olivia's happy voice shouted at me after a couple of seconds of the dialing noise. She is like the world's greatest stress ball. It took all my fear and anxiety away. You're on speaker. Mommy's driving right now, she said with nothing but excitement. Hello, Travis. We are about an hour and a half away from you, Alexandra told me. She had been spending her free time learning how to drive a car. She certainly was better at it than I was, but that isn't saying much. But she can drive safely, so that's really all that matters. Sounds good. I'll be waiting in my dorm for you guys, I said, taking a seat on the couch, and just hoping that nothing horrible happened to me in that amount of time. After all was said and done, I was once again left alone in the dorm. Sighing and trying to keep my cool, I elected to just turn the TV on and just distract myself. I pulled up Netflix and just put on anything so I could have some noise to keep me distracted. I also pulled out some of the work I had to do for class and started doing it. It worked so well, in fact, that when I heard knocking at my dorm room, I almost believed that it was some random person or worse. But looking at my phone, I saw it was about the time when Olivia and Alexandra were going to show up. Standing up and opening the door for them, I was quickly hugged by Olivia. Travis, me and Tempe missed you, she shouted, nuzzling her face into my stomach, smiling and showing me the little voodoo template that had once been the way I had checked into work. I smiled and patted her little blonde head. You look well, Travis, Alexandra told me, her soft motherly smile greeting me as she entered my dorm, and also gave me a hug. I returned the favor, and had them sit down on the couch. I got up, and got them some refreshments, which just boiled down to some water in a glass of ice. I'm living it up in college. I don't know what it means, Travis, Alexandra told me after I had explained everything that had been happening to me. I sighed as I looked at her and Olivia. How could Creole have dragged himself out of hell, or wherever it was that Baron Samedi had sent him? Tempe says that he doesn't know either, Olivia said, holding the old doll up. I sighed at that as well. I would have hoped that Tempe would know something about that. So we really were in the dark. I sighed and reached out for my glass of water, when Brian's bedroom door opened, and he came stumbling out of his room. Hey, dude. I thought you worked today, I told him, sitting up a bit and only a bit confused and concerned by it. Seeing him stumbling around a bit, I would have thought he was drunk, but it really didn't even seem like that. It was like he was being pulled along by something. I wanted to, but I couldn't, he said, his voice showing that he was straining against something. And it was revealed what that was when Preston Brooks came up behind Brian. I stood up quickly, and Alexandra did as well. Olivia, reading the room, quickly shuffled to hide behind me. "Good morning," Preston said, a voodoo doll in his hand, one that looked exactly like Brian. "Please have a seat, I'll only take a moment of your time," he said with a calm chuckle, forcing Brian to walk over near us as he walked over towards the door. "Hand over the template doll, and I'll be on my way," he said, holding his hand out for Tempe. "Like hell, I will," I said back to him, pushing Olivia behind me some more. "I knew there was something wrong with you," I hissed, looking around for any kind of weapon. I was really wishing that we had glass cups. At least for some kind of weapon. Oh, far more than just something, Travis. Preston chuckled, which turned into hard and violent coughs. Not being able to grab a handkerchief, he covered his mouth with his hand. And when he finished and pulled his hand back, a long sticky black ooze followed it. "I don't have much time. Just give me the fucking doll," he shouted at us, much more panicked. "Travis, I don't think it would be wise to give him the doll," Alexandra told me. As badly as I wanted to be sarcastic towards her, now was neither the time nor the place to be my usual asshole self. Preston gripped the voodoo doll tightly, and I could tell Brian felt it as he hitched his breath and struggled to breathe. "The doll, or your stupid roommate gets it," he shouted, grabbing the voodoo Brian's head and clutching it. Brian stared at me, obviously conflicted since it was obvious giving him Tempe was a terrible idea. But at the same time, it was obvious that he didn't want to die. I turned to Olivia and she looked back at me, carefully handing the doll to me. "He says it's okay," she whispered to me, though it was obvious that she was going to miss it. I sighed and took the doll from her, moving over towards Preston, holding Tempe up and handing it over to him. Tempe usually has plenty of tricks up his sleeves, so I was hoping he had something. "Give it to me," he hissed, the goop dripping down his chin. I handed it off to him. He took Tempe and shoved Brian away from him. I caught him as he went limp. I held him up and helped him over to Alexandra, who took him quickly. Though by her looks she wasn't all that happy that I had given Tempe to Preston. I was sort of vindicated in my choice when Preston cried out in pain. We all looked over as Tempe had produced little razor blade claws and began slicing the man's hand up. He soon dropped the doll, which quickly scurried away under the couch. "No," Preston shouted, getting down on his hands and knees and trying to get at Tempe before he got out of his grasp. But he was soon stopped by another round of coughs that brought him to the floor. "Ah fuck. And no, I need more time," the man shouted, wheezing and struggling up to his feet. We all braced for what was about to happen, Olivia still hiding behind me, and Alexandra tending to Brian on the couch, and Tempe sticking his head out to watch what was happening. Preston panted hard as he coughed more and more. Soon it sounded less and less dry, as the black ooze spilled out of his mouth mixed with blood. And then a hand shot out of his mouth. Not just a regular hand. One that had long fingers and claws attached to it. It was the first time I heard Alexandra actually scream in terror. Here I saw that her usual calm manner was completely destroyed by this horrible scene. Preston collapsed to his knees as the hand began to pull itself further out, revealing a wrist and arm attached to it. And it was only then that it hit me who that arm belonged to. And it was confirmed when Preston's back split open with a sickening crunch and tears, and a long gangly creature stood up from the remains. Besides the arm that had the head wrapped around it, we all knew exactly what it was in front of us. "Travis, my boy, did you miss me?" Creole chuckled as he stepped forward. But this wasn't normal Creole. It was the Creole from my nightmares. He tilted his head at me, a sickening horrid smile on his face. He was back. And his horrifying look matched his sadistic personality. Reduced to the role of a glorified butler for all these freaks was certainly a low point in this fucked up rodeo called my life. Looking around the kitchen like an idiot for the wine that was requested, I was moments from giving up and facing Creole's wrath, when a little tug at my side caught my attention. Pulling Tempe out of my pocket, I saw that the little voodoo doll was pointing in the direction of a cabinet. Walking over and opening it up, I breathed a sigh of relief as I reached out and grabbed one of the bottles of wine. "I owe you one," I told the little doll. placing him back in my pocket and sighing as I started back towards the dining room. Stopping at the door and taking a deep breath, I put on my stupid smile and exited the kitchen, and walked into a scene that wouldn't have looked out of place in a Three Stooges short. "Eat with a fork, you disgusting freak," Sinclair shouted at the long-haired Garibaldi. He was seemingly eating an entire rotisserie chicken by himself. Garibaldi was the odd one out of the four creatures seated at the table. While they all wore suits, he wore a Red Ringleader's shirt, his nails painted, and even his eyes threw me off when he turned to look at me, seemingly ignoring Sinclair's shouts and curses. "There you are, Travis. Seems like you've almost been gone a month," he chuckled, motioning me to come over with the bottle of wine I was holding on to. Nodding, I kept the stupid fake smile on my face and walked over to the table, carefully placing it on the table and backing away slightly. "Leave it to you to turn the boy into a doormat," Sinclair hissed, turning his attention from the increasingly messy scene of Garibaldi eating over to the two of us. Sinclair peered at me with his deeply sunken eyes. I did my best to keep the smile plastered on my face, praying that Creole still hadn't noticed that he no longer was controlling me. "Boy, go get me a cigar," the man ordered me, pointing at me and snapping his fingers at me. I looked over at Creole to see if he was okay with this, but my captor was far too busy talking to Monsieur Leblanc to have even noticed what had been ordered of me. Nodding to him, I walked over to a small table set up near the kitchen's entrance. A box full of cigars sitting there. I took one out and acted like I knew what I was doing with it, trying to remember how my father used to smoke his. Snipping the end off with the cutter, I walked back over to Sinclair and handed it to him, fishing in my pockets and taking out a Zippo that I had also taken from the table. As I flipped it open and tried to spark it, my hand was grabbed by the black mass that followed Sinclair everywhere. Looking up in fear, I managed to get a good look at the creature as it stared at me. White eyes stared back at me. It was vaguely human-shaped, but appeared to be dripping, and its lower half was firmly stuck to the wall. "You don't light a cigar with a fucking lighter, you stupid shit stain," the man hissed at me, standing up from his seat at the table and reaching out to grab me by my collar. He had the look of murderous rage on his face, and I was sure he would do something horrible to me, when all of a sudden a loud crash pulled both of our attention over towards Creole. He was standing up, gritting his teeth, his cane embedded in the table with just how hard he had smacked it down. "You best be letting go of my clerk before you lose that fucking hand, Sinclair," Creole hissed, that same murderous look on his buttons as he stared at us both. Sinclair scoffed and shoved me away, him and his shadow creature turning their attention towards Creole. "Maybe if you taught him how to light a cigar properly, I wouldn't have to educate him," Sinclair spat, lifting the cigar I had cut up to his lips and taking his seat. His shadow produced a match for him and carefully lit it for him. I meanwhile had been caught by the strings and regained my fake composure, a smile still on my face. "Travis, be a dear and go to the kitchen. I have to teach Mr. Sinclair here a lesson," Creole said sweetly to me, pulling his cane out of the wood and walking over to Sinclair. I didn't bother to stay and watch as I quickly nodded and ducked into the kitchen, waiting till the door closed behind me before starting to hyperventilate. Being nearly touched by Sinclair had sent me over the edge, and I was reduced to a complete mess. I was barely able to hold myself up. "Why does this shit keep happening to me?" I whimpered, putting my hands over my mouth and panting hard as I tried to regain some composure. Feeling soft hugs coming to my side, I reached my pocket inside and pulled Tempe out. His little arms were raised up at me, and I collapsed to the floor, hugging the little plush doll close as I was near seconds from sobbing. Finally, having regained some composure, I rubbed his little head as thanks and put him back in my pocket. Looking around the kitchen for a weapon, I settled on a steak knife having been left in the sink to be cleaned. Stuffing that into my pocket as well, I turned to return to the feast, assuming it was safe to do so. Creole and Sinclair were sitting back down and seemingly ignoring the others' presence. "Ah, Travis, my boy. Good that you're back. Seems we have some unwanted company at the shop. My blood ran cold as he said this. Could you be a dear, and go deal with them? He said with a smile, which produced a snort from Sinclair, who wiped his mouth with his napkin. Same reason why you use the blonde whore at your rehab center, to do all your dirty work. He chuckled, licking his plate of all the juices that had dripped out of his chicken, which was completely gone, bones and all. Sinclair rose from his seat and walked past me, his shadow getting goop on my shoes as he did. Grabbing Garibaldi from the hair, he slammed him down on the plate and proceeded to shove his face into it. Act like the disgusting insect you are, and I shall treat you as such, he shouted, his shadow giving him a hand and shoving the ringleader into his own plate. Sinclair rose from his seat and walked past me, his shadow getting goop on my shoes as he did. Grabbing Garibaldi from the hair, he slammed him down on the plate and proceeded to shove his face into it. Act like the disgusting insect you are, and I shall treat you as such, he shouted, his shadow giving him a hand and shoving the ringleader into his own plate. Careful, bugs bite. Garibaldi snickered as his voice became distorted and another sickening crunch came from his head. Peeking over Creel's seat at his face, I saw that Garibaldi's face had split open from the scar on his face, and a row of teeth and a tongue made itself known. Careful, bugs bite. Garibaldi snickered as his voice became distorted and another sickening crunch came from his head. Peeking over Creel's seat at his face, I saw that Garibaldi's face had split open from the scar on his face, and a row of teeth and a tongue made itself known. Sorry, Travis. They always do that. Please be dear, and deal with the guests in the shop. I'll handle them here. He chuckled, giving me a firm pat on the shoulder, and sending me on my way. Nodding quickly, I turned to go, and escape from this increasingly horrible dinner. Right away, King Creel, sir. I said in my kiss-ass tone, and quickly stepped over to the door. Mere inches away from it, I felt a hard clammy hand grip my wrist. Nearly letting out a scream, I looked over to see the wheelchair-bound LeBlanc seemingly sniffing at me, and looking up at me with his silver mask firmly on his face. You've already eaten, monsieur. Besides, you'll get indigestion with this undead creature, his nurse told him, grabbing his hand and prying it off of me. Looking at her, I barely even gave her thanks as I left her and everyone behind, going out the door and nearly slamming it behind me, panting hard and wanting to cry now more than ever. Travis, came a soft little voice I was more than familiar with. Turning and seeing Olivia with Brian, I did start crying, even if no tears came out. Falling to my knees as she came over to me, I wrapped my arms around her and squeezed her. She did as well with all her little might. Pulling back a bit, I reached into my pocket and produced Tempe for her. She started bawling her eyes out when she saw him, and quickly scooped him up in her arms. I gotta say, man. Brian suddenly spoke up, causing me to look over at him. Your hair looks a lot better when it's all messy. I couldn't help but let out a genuine chuckle at that, as I stood up and offered my fist out to my roommate turned friend. He smiled and returned the fist bump and made room for Riley. I swallowed hard when I saw her, quickly looking back at Brian. It's okay. He filled me in. Kinda, it was hard to understand. He paraphrased a lot. She chuckled. I looked over to Brian, who gave me a thumbs up as he lifted up a still crying Olivia into his arms. I looked back at Riley and sighed hard at her. Sorry. Would I hear what he said? I mumbled to her, rubbing my arm and avoiding making eye contact with her. She chuckled and went to give me a hug, only for me to back up away from her. Right. You've been through a lot, Travis. I'm really sorry for everything. She told me, keeping her distance from me. I smiled at her, and moved my hand through my hair, finally being able to look at her with a soft smile of my own. How sweet. Creel chuckled as he closed the door to the dinner behind him, causing all of us to stare at him in horror. Seems you broke free, Travis. I'll give you props, boy. You had me completely fooled. He chuckled, tapping his cane on the floor of the new Voodoo shop. I backed up away from him as the strings once again pulled tight on my body, and I was forced to walk my way over to him, that stupid smile plastered on my face. "Let Travis go," Olivia screamed at the top of her little lungs, thrashing around in Brian's arms. Creel jerked his head over to her, and smiled as he walked over to her. Brian started backing up and Creel stopped in his tracks. "Travis." He turned to me with a smile, walking back over, and grabbing me by the arms. "Be a good boy, and get Olivia for me." He patted me on the head, and backed away as I was forced to nod, and fished the knife out of my pocket. "Right away, sir," I hummed, walking over towards Brian who kept backing away from me. I tried desperately to try and fight the strings. I did my best, but the loud smack on the back of my head really helped me out. Collapsing to the floor like a sack of potatoes, my head turned to see Riley having hit me in the back of the head with a tire iron. Definitely ranks up there in terms of the pain of things inflicted on me. "He's done following your orders," Riley shouted at Creel, lifting the tire iron up at the Voodoo man. He chuckled and raised his arms up, to which my body did the exact same thing as it was pulled up by the strings. The only thing Riley had really accomplished was knocking out my physical body. The strings now much more easily controlled me. Chuckling, Creel spun on his heels and headed back towards the dining room. "Travis, be a dear, and see that your friends are taken care of," Creel hummed, walking to the door, and closing it shut behind him as he entered it. I was being pulled around harder than ever before as I fished the knife from the floor, and waved it about in front of me. Wordlessly I slashed at Riley, as she did her best to try and stop me from doing it. "Travis, snap out of it," Riley screamed as she lifted her arms up in a defensive pose. I slashed her deep in her arms as she backed up and screamed at me to stop. As I lifted up my knife to slash her deeply, I suddenly was stabbed in the back of my leg. The strings twisted my head to look down and see that it was Olivia. She held up a tiny pocket knife as she desperately stabbed at me. "Stop it, Travis. Please," Olivia shouted, mixing her little stabbings with pointings of her fist. Looking down at her and realizing that without Alexandra that she was going to be all alone, I mustered what little strength I had in my body and lifted the knife up, bringing it down on a few of the strings that became tangled in the blade. When I had lifted the knife up quickly, the threads were cut and half of me went flopping to the floor as I fell next to Olivia. Getting the idea, Olivia quickly came over to me and started cutting the strings that remained off of me. Setting her tiny knife down, she kneeled next to me and made strained little grunts as she tried to force me to sit up. Her little hands never made me flinch in fear. I knew that she genuinely cared for me. Steadying myself as some of my motor functions came back, Brian and Riley quickly came over to offer the help I needed to stand back up. "Thanks guys," I said softly, rubbing the back of my head, where Riley had conked me. Somewhat thankful that I really couldn't be killed by head trauma. Leaning on Brian, we started for the entrance, only to find it chained from the outside. "Got to give you kids some props. Y'all are a persistent bunch." Creel chuckled as he drummed his fingers on the counter. He sat there next to the cash register. His gloved fingers drummed happily on the desk as he looked up at us. "Of course, I can't just let y'all leave with my school clerk. Bad for business, if I just let employees do whatever they want." Creel reached an arm behind the counter and produced a voodoo doll of me before us all. Swallowing hard, I looked down at Olivia and at everyone. Pushing off of Brian, I slowly stumbled and approached Creel, who raised a brow at me coming towards him. Coming up to the counter, I slammed my hand down in front of him and pointed my finger at him. "Take me, and leave them alone," I hissed at him. "Bring Alexandra back. We both know that Olivia doesn't deserve this," I said, standing back a bit and staring down at Creel. Everyone behind me was shouting at the top of their lungs and calling me crazy. Creel, obviously annoyed, snapped his fingers and gagged all of them at once. "Look at you, Travis my boy. Trying to be selfless for once." Creel chuckled, standing up and looking at me. Our button eyes meet each other. He rubbed his chin as he pulled away and thought aloud. Well, it certainly would be a lovely deal. Getting to torture you all to myself, and not having to worry about you planning on escaping. 'Cause if you do, well, deal's off, isn't it? He asked me, looking around me as he hummed and tapped his cane across the floor, obviously enjoying the scenario placed before him. I'll be your puppet again. If Olivia gets Alexander back. None of your funny business either, 'cause if you do for a second, I'm ending the fun you'll have over me, I said. He raised a brow at that, obviously wondering what I meant when I said that. To show what I was talking about, I quickly fished out Olivia's tiny pocket knife I had snagged and started to cut away at the threads across my neck. Everyone behind me let out a muffled scream as I did so, and even Creole was taken aback, and reached out to quickly grab my arm with one hand and seal up my quickly leaking wound with the other. "Oh, you're serious, huh? Really think you can handle everything I have in store for you, Travis? There ain't no coming back from this," he said, yanking the knife from my hands, and putting more pressure on my neck, to staunch the black goop leaking from me. "Just leave them alone, and do whatever you want with me," I spat back at him, to which he smiled and nodded. He broke out some thread and quickly fixed the stitching across my neck. I was suddenly met with loud crying as Olivia ran to me, and hit me over and over again. "I don't want you to leave, Travis," she screamed, crying heavily and refusing to let go of me. I weakly wrapped my arms around her, and gave her a squeeze as I tried to pry her off of me. Creole turned his back to us and walked off. Soon a bright glow turned our attention to a spot on the floor where Alexandra had reappeared. I picked Olivia up and walked over, handing the crying and thrashing girl to her. She gave me a look of understanding, and gave me a hug and kiss on the forehead. Turning to Brian and Riley, I couldn't help myself, and hugged the two of them, squeezing them hard as I did my best to keep from falling and crying my buttons off. Finally, I pulled back, and waved to everyone. "Thanks for everything, you guys," I said in a cracking voice as I once again felt the strings wrapping their way around me, and causing my sadness to vanish. Replaced by happiness, I waved away more vigorously and giggled. "Please come back again soon." I felt that same hand come on my shoulder as the people I loved were pulled out of the shop by some unforeseen force. "It's great to have you back, Travis, my boy. Once I finish up this dinner, the two of us will pack up and move shop. I'm sure you'll love it." Creole chuckled, patting my head and walking past me as I turned to give him a little salute. "I can't wait, King Creole, sir," I answered with a smile on my face as I sat at my post at the cash register. I don't really know how long it's been since that day. I don't really get to go outside anymore, but that's okay. I don't need to. I just stand at my post and wait for poor souls that need King Creole's help. I do get sorta sad when I think back to what I used to have in life, but then I just remember how amazing of a boss King Creole is, and all those thoughts are washed away. How could I ask for a better boss than him? Everyone should strive for a boss like him. Lovely and positive at all times of the day. Patient and really just amazing. Travis really is too kind to me. He certainly gets what comes to him every day. Flattery won't get him anywhere, however. After all, he really doesn't need to go anywhere. I do hope you've enjoyed your stay here at All King Creole's half-priced Voodoo store, but I must ask that you leave. I can't stand loiterers. This has been Travis, from the half-priced Voodoo store. Thanks for visiting.